Hello, Internet, and thank you very much for tuning into the Cloud Native Islamabad YouTube channel. This is another Cloud Native workshop, and I believe you will like if you are a developer, then you learned a lot from this workshop today. So in this workshop today, we will explore how Kubernetes can be harnessed to empower developer development environment using the open source project. I really like Octato CLI. And after watching this session, you will gain insight into the benefit of Kubernetes based development environment, and you will see a live demo on setting up Kubernetes cluster. And you have a clear understanding of how Kubernetes can enhance development workflow. So let me straight go to my guest today on the workshop, Arsh Sharma, Developer Experience Engineer at Octato. Thank you very much, Arsh. Can you give us some quick intro of you and then start the proceeding?
Yeah. Hey, hi everyone. Thanks for having me. I'm really excited for this stream because this is a topic which is like very close to my heart. We'll get to that, but a bit of introduction about me. I'm Arsh. I work at a startup called Octeto, and we prioritize and work on like creating the development experiences for this cloud native world. So we do like developer experience automation, and a lot of our platform is based towards helping developers develop these cloud native applications we are seeing more and more of these days. Other than that, I'm also active contributor to the Kubernetes project, and I'm also a CNCF ambassador, just like my friend here. With the introductions done, should we just get started?
Yes, absolutely. So I will be off the screen now, and I hope everybody can be able to see our screen as well. If you don't, please send your comment on the chat as well. And if you have any question, feel free to put them on the comment section, the YouTube chat channel, and I will ask as we go. Now it's your turn, Arsh, over to you. So I will be moving away from the screen.
Cool. So the topic of this workshop is going to be leveraging Kubernetes to enable a cloud native development experience. A lot of words here, but we'll tackle each of them one by one in the following slides. So let's just get started. I already introduced myself, so we can skip this slide. But the first thing I want to do is set the right context, because it is really important to understand why this topic is becoming more and more relevant in today's world, right? Like, if you remember, like 5 6 years ago, nobody was talking about that much, at least, about development experience and these dev environments. They are relatively new term which has come up in the industry. So what happened? The thing is that if you remember, before containerization became a thing, before containers and Kubernetes changed the game, like I've written here, everyone was developing monoliths. And like, we know monoliths, we have now learned the hard way that monoliths aren't that scalable. They have their own problems. But say whatever you want about monoliths, they were relatively easy to develop, right? Like, you could spin up the entire monolith on your local machine and then do your code changes, commit them, push them, and you would know that how things were running on your local machine. That's how they would work in production, because there aren't any differences, because the monolith, when it runs in production, it's just a server executing that code. So that is not very different from you running that code locally on your machine. But then Docker came in and it popularized containerization. We all started talking about containers and making our applications and splitting them into microservices. Now, everyone liked this idea because microservices are very like easy to scale as compared to monoliths. So we all jumped on board and we started breaking down our monoliths and started converting them into microservices based applications. And the thing with microservices are that they were easy to manage until they weren't. Like, there are some problems with microservices, and especially when it comes to development. So the thing is that when you are developing a microservice, right, like, you never really have to develop a single microservice. You always want to see how one microservice interacts with the other one and how they all play together and how the entire application behaves. So as a result of that, you if you are developing locally and just developing on working on one particular microservice, that means that the environment you are developing in isn't realistic because you're not being able to see the change on the entire application. Let's talk about all of this in the context of like, you know, to do application, because that's what the demo is. So let's take a to do application. There's a front end, there's a back end, and there's a database service. Now you have to make some change on the front end, maybe on the add button, but you can't just run the front end on your machine locally, right? Because you won't be able to see if the button is actually working. So what you'll need to do, you'll need to bring up the back end. What you'll need to do is not just bring up the backend, you'll also need to bring up the database. Now, all of this you see is starting to get very complicated. And this is just 3 microservices. The applications you develop in production are like 20 or even more number of microservices. So it gets complicated for developers having to bring each of these microservices up on their machine locally. So what do they do? What solutions do they have? Well, one commonly seen solution is they'll just work on the front end and, just add that button on the front end and then push and commit their code. And then the CI will actually determine if the entire application is working or not. Or they could just work on that independent front end and then wait for access to a staging environment and then verify that the entire application is actually working or not. But you see, both of these methods aren't the ideal experience. Like, you were getting the ideal experience with monoliths where you could just see the effects of your application and the code you write as soon as you hit save, whereas that's not possible now because of microservices. So not only this problem which I talked about is the first step, which is like setting up the dev environment, which has become very tough and which has become a huge problem now that we have started talking about microservices. The workaround to this people came up with was, Docker Compose, like running your containers locally, like these containers microservice. You would have all of this defined in a Docker Compose file. You would run Docker Compose up, and the entire application would be up and running. Now, that's one solution, but that is not the ideal solution, I feel, because this is where it starts to get tricky. You can run a few containers locally, but if you start running 20 containers which have heavy workloads, then your machine will start to become the bottleneck. This is problem number one. The problem number two is with trying to replicate this container system locally is that you are at the end of the day still running containers, and that is very different from how things run in production, because in production you're using Kubernetes, so you are not running containers individually. They are being encapsulated by pods, and the pods are being managed by deployments or stateful sets. And then you have ingress rules, and the data is coming from config maps, and all of that is happening. And if you use Docker Compose, then you are not really mimicking that environment. And that is not a good way for developers to develop applications, because now there's a huge gap between the environment you develop in and the production environment you deploy to. And this is widely known across in the industry that whenever there is a huge gap, there will be bugs which are hard to notice, and they're hard to notice in the first place because replicating them locally is not possible. If you were able to replicate them locally, then they wouldn't have gone unnoticed in the first place. So when we talk about like a cloud native development experience, we want to ensure that, setting up the dev environment, like developers should be able to get to the code writing phase very easily. They should not have to run different microservices like locally on their machine, or have to, spin up local Kubernetes clusters like Kind or Minikube to try to replicate the production. None of that. It should be easy and fast enough to get to, and it should be like production. There should not be a huge gap between development and production, because as long as there is that gap, you can be sure that, something or the other will go wrong. Let me check the chat now to see if there are any questions so far. By the way, please feel free to like ask your questions anytime. Like, I'll answer them. So enough talking about the problem. Like, what is the solution? Like, is the solution just getting frustrated with developments and running and going off living in the mountains? Sorry for the bad joke, but I believe that the solution for this should be cloud, because it is cloud and containers and Kubernetes which created these problems for us, right? And it is only fair that we rely on them to solve these problems, because that's where the gap started, right? We started changing things on the production side, on the DevOps side, deployment side, and now we need to change things in the development side to make sure that it is in tune with what is happening in production, so that we can bridge the gap between the two. This brings me to an open source project, which is Octeto CLI. It is a completely open source CLI tool. You can see the source code at github.com/octeto/octeto. And the goal of this project is to improve the development experience for developers when developing cloud native applications. So we try to like overcome all the shortcomings we discussed and talked about in the previous slides. So we want to improve the development experience by making sure developers are able to get to the code writing phase immediately. Now, this means they should not have to, like we were talking about in the example of the to-do application, they should not have to run the front end, then the back end, and the database. No, none of that. They should be able to have their application deployed in a matter of seconds and then just be able to code on that. Because all of this, like the more steps you have in before developers can start writing code, that hampers developer productivity and leads to a frustrating developer experience, and you do not want your developers to deal with that, because they already have like other things to worry about. So this is where like I feel there should be a separation of concerns among different teams, and that's why we are seeing the topic of platform engineering really rise up in the industry, because more and more organizations are now realizing that developers cannot be responsible for doing all the setup and then actually working on the application as well. There needs to be a team which owns this creating of dev environments which are fast, which are ephemeral for developers. Then another goal of ours with this project was to provide realistic environments to develop in. We do not want developers to be developing in an environment which is different from production, because like I said earlier, that will lead to bugs. That would mean developers are not sure if if their changes will work in production or not, and you want to be able to give your developers that certainty when they are writing the code, that the code they write will work in production. And the two ways organizations do this right now is via CI/CD or staging environments. Now, both of them have their shortcomings. With CI/CD, I feel the problem is that it happens after you commit and it takes like time if your applications are bigger, right? Like the CI could take anywhere from 15 minutes to an hour. And it's not as simple as just hitting save and then you get to see your change. You have to commit it and then you have to wait for the CI to run its jobs. So that feedback takes time. And as a developer, when you're writing code, you want to get immediate feedback. You want to be sure that as soon as you write some code, hit save, you're able to, get that feedback that yes, my code is working in production. My application will work. My commit will work when I push it. That solves the part for CI/CD, but staging environments also suffer from similar problems where like you have to fight to get access to the staging environments, because if one team is using it, the other cannot, and then you have to do all these cleanups, and like it's just a complicated process, and it's not immediate. Then the other thing was we want to solve the limitations of workflows with like Docker Compose, where we want to remove the load away from local machines. We do not want developers to be running everything locally, because that takes up resources from your machine, and not everyone is running the fanciest, latest MacBooks with 64 GBs of RAM and other fancy specs. So we want to take away this load, because none of this processing is should be done on the local machine, because that not only will save resources for you to run other things on your machine, but will also ensure that you start running containers in a way which is like in production. So containers which are being managed by pods which are being managed by deployments or stateful sets. And that other problem which we wanted to solve was that we talk about bridging the gap and creating a realistic environment, and that means leveraging Kubernetes during development, because that's the only way you'll be able to actually be sure that your dev environment is like production. But at the same time, you do not want developers to be having to do all of this. They should not be having to be experts in how to deploy the application to Kubernetes, because that's not their job. And that's what I was talking to you about earlier. Like, that's where the platform team comes into picture. So we wanted to abstract away the complexities of Kubernetes and, automate things for developers as much as possible so that they have a fantastic development experience. Any questions so far?
I don't see it, Arsh, on the chat, on the comment section, but can you elaborate on this point? Like sometimes people feel like if you can create a platform in, if you can create another platform engineering team, and then developers might to ask, like they will create a ephemeral environment for you. But currently, you see there's are some web-based experience for developers. Like you can go to the web browser, type in a URL. Even VS Code is embedded into the in the GitHub right now. In the, you can actually go and start developing application in it. So if that's the case, if that's the way is actually we going forward with it, so having like a local development versus a browser development, how much the overlapping challenges of both technologies have?
So while we are, seeing people transition to like these cloud-based IDEs, I would call them cloud-based IDEs, which is and not like, proper like development environments in the context of what I am talking. The difference lies in that even if you're if you put your IDE on the cloud, that solves some part of the picture. But then again, that IDE is just basically a process running in a server, right? So when you bring up your application using Docker Compose, it will still suffer from those gaps that your application is just running as like containers. Or maybe if you just, if it's a React app, for example, and you just run npm start on your VS Code on the cloud, then that is just an isolated process. And then that again suffers from the same second half of the problems which we were talking about, which is that it is nothing like production. And then for like, it does not give you the feedback that your changes will work in production. And then in the end, you end up relying on CI or staging environments. So IDEs on the cloud solve a part of this picture. Like they solve the bullet point of like, removing the load away from local machines. So they do make things easy for developers, but they do not solve the entire thing. And the best part about Octeto CLI, this project, as we'll soon see, is that it can be used with both. Octeto CLI is just a CLI, and you can install that on your like VS Code on the browser or Gitpod or obviously a local machine. So I think we've talked enough, and things would start to make sense for people if start to see them in action. So let's just go to our demo. I'll stop sharing my screen and switch to my IDE. Awesome. Let me just change the screen size a bit. So before we get to the demo, let me just walk you through this application a bit. And this is the same to-do list application we were talking about. It's a to-do list application. You can go to the UI, add to-dos. And this has like 3 microservices. It has a React front end, which is the code for which is under the client directory. It has a Postgres database, and it has a Node.js Express server. Now, the traditional way of developing this application would have been using a Docker Compose file like the one I have here. So you would have like different services, and like you would build these containers and run them locally. Now, the problems we have already discussed, that this takes resources on your machine. This is nothing like production, and developers have to be, like reliant on CI/CD or staging environments for immediate feedback. And it's overall just not a good development experience because there are like other features you miss out on. So what I want to introduce you to this idea of like new cloud native development with Octeto CLI. And the way Octeto CLI works, the first step for that is creating a file called the octeto.yaml. This file is basically broken down into 3 sections, which is the build, deploy, and the dev section. The build section tells Octeto how to build the application images. Now, you could say that, we can get the images from Docker Hub from the latest release of the application which was put. But we want the latest code, right? When a developer gets to write code, they want to be able to, like start from the latest code which is there. That's why we provide the context for where the Docker files are. Let's say, for example, like here the Docker file is inside the client directory, so we set the context as like the server and the client, and then it will read the Docker file and build the image from the latest code. The second section is where all of the magic I was talking to you about happens, which is where we deploy this application on an actual Kubernetes cluster. And this is where we emphasize that when you go to this world of cloud native development environments, we ask platform teams which set up these environments for developers to use the same manifests they use to deploy this application to production and just swap the image you are using. Because the whole idea is that you want everything to be like it is in production. So if you're using Helm in production, deploy those same Helm charts during development. If you're using something like Customize or maybe even just like vanilla like Kubernetes manifest, you can add them here and like run them in the deploy section. So we can take a look at some of these. Like for the client, we have a Helm chart, and that's like a Kubernetes deployment, and we have a Kubernetes service which exposes the front end. Then we have an ingress which takes care of routing traffic to different services, the front end and the back end. And for all of this, we have created a Helm chart. So the idea is that you use the same manifests you use when deploying to production to create this dev environment. And the last section is the dev section, where you tell Octeto CLI how to control your dev environment, like things like, so this will make sense once you see it in action, but what folders you want to sync from the like local machine to the container running in the cloud. And let me get back to this session once we see the demo. So working with Octeto CLI is pretty simple. You create this Octeto manifest, then you just need the CLI installed on your machine. And now this does not have to be a local machine like you talked earlier. Like this can easily be VS Code on the cloud or GitHub code spaces or Gitpod or anything. And all you have to do is run this one command called Octeto deploy. And what this command will do is it will basically go through all the commands which are in the deploy section and run them individually one by one. So it'll first build the images if the images need to be built. And we have a image. So in my case, I had already run this command, so the images were already built from the latest code, so it didn't build them. But you can now see that it is running deploy node.js backend, which is the command, which is the Helm command to install the Node.js part of this application. And soon you'll see that like it'll say that your application is now deployed and it is up for running. What this does it gives you endpoints where you can see your application. And I just realized I'm going to have to change to, I think, share my full screen because I need to show the browser as well. So just give me a second. Stop my screen share and let me share my entire screen. Awesome. So you'll see that we have these endpoints, and when we go to these endpoints in our browser, you will see that, let me just go here in case it's showing multiple. You'll see that we can now access our application. Like this is an actual working copy of our application. So we can go ahead and add a to-do. Let's just call it hello, and we can add it, and we can see that our application is working. And this is exactly how this application would get deployed in production. The next step is that once you have this up and running, the CLI tells you that you can run Octeto up to activate your development container. Now let's run it, and then I'll talk more about what a development container is. So when you run this Octeto up command, what it will do is it will list the microservices which you can develop on your application. So in our case, that's the front end and the back end. The Postgres database is not really a image, like it's just a Postgres image from their official Docker Hub. So that's not something you can develop. And the code for the database lives in the server, so that's why it's not listing that here. But you can choose between client and you get in the front end and the back end, which is the client and the server respectively. So let's choose client, and this is where like any developer, whatever they want to develop on, they can choose. And it's not just one service. You can spin up another terminal, run Octeto up here, and work on multiple services simultaneously. And what this will do is allow you to work on one service without having to, you have to manually deploy all the other services. So let's say we wanted to work on the front end, we did not have to manually deploy the back end or spin up the database, which is a complicated task, right? As a developer, we just had to run Octeto deploy, which was very fast. So that's one part. And now let me talk to you about what a development container is. So when we deployed this application, we have now containers running in the Kubernetes cluster where we have created this development environment, right? What a development container does is it replaces the container which is running for that particular service. So in our case, it replaces the container which is running for the React front end with a container which has all the dev tools you need to, work on a React application. And what this does is the second cool part, which is like the main thing, is that it synchronizes the files from your local machine to that in this dev container. So whatever changes I make on my local machine, those files, like those changes go directly to the dev container, and I see the result of my changes as soon as I hit save. So this is what we were doing in the dev section, like for the client. Like this, we get access to a terminal here, and now this terminal process is not like running locally on my machine. In fact, it is a terminal inside the dev container which is there in the Kubernetes cluster. So the command I have here basically is npm start, and so it automatically started my service. And then I say that I want to synchronize the client directory with the app folder inside this dev container. So if we go back here and hit refresh, like we see our application copy is still there, but now we can actually work on this application and write code. So if I were to change the name of this application from Octeto do to just simply to do list, which is a lot more pronounceable, I hit save. What happens is that the dev contain, like my file change went to the Kubernetes clusters container. Then this process running there, saw that React does this, npm does this. Like it sees when you change something, so it rebuilt the application. And when I go back to my browser and I hit refresh, you'll see that this changed. And this is the magic of this approach. Like now, as a developer, you can be sure that the code you write will work in production, because this environment we are writing our code in is exactly like production. It's using the same manifest, and this is what CI or staging environments also do, right? They use the same manifest you use to deploy to production, and then you're able to get that feedback. But the best part is that, like, if you're using CI/CD or staging environments, then you have to build a final application image, which means you cannot easily just go back and change this to just to do hit save and make sure that that looks better. You can't do that, because each time you would have to build the application image. Whereas here, thanks to the file synchronization service, we are not able to develop in an environment which is like production, but we are also able to iterate fast using this file synchronization feature. So that was it. That's what I had for the demo. I'm gonna stop my screen share now and just like open up the floor for any questions or any discussions people want to have on development experience. And I can switch to the slides. Just give me a second. But this was it from my side. Like, if you like this, go check out the project Octeto CLI at github.com/Octeto. If you want to check out the complete product, you can visit the website at octeto.com. And if any time you have questions about the product, about Kubernetes, about development experience, you can either reach out to me on Twitter. You can see my handle below. Or if it's a technical question, you can post on our community website, which is community.octeto.com.
Thanks, Sarge, for the quick and wonderful demo. Just a few questions from my side. Is number one, like people like to think like, is there a possibility to spin up pre-production environment using Octeto?
Uh, what would you say like a pre-production, like this environment could also be called like a pre-production environment, right? Because like the whole idea is like, if you are developing in this, like, we don't say that people will obviously get rid of staging environments have their way, but with this approach, like, your reliance on staging environments decreases a lot. Like, they are now just like the final green check, because if your things are working in this like dev environment, then they're pretty likely to work in staging environments as well. So we do not spin up, like, to answer your question, we do not spin up exactly pre-production like environments. The idea is you have a cluster which is particularly for development, and then you just deploy your applications using Octeto deploy, and then you develop them using Octeto up.
Got it. So I think that my absolutely, I get it. But I think like what I feel like sometime when you, let's say, you want to do a canary rollout or some kind of fancy deployment in the production. So before switching your traffic into the production system, you want to something test it up locally. And if you look at, I think sometime there's a scenario like when you create a, you have set it as you submit a commit in the GitHub, and then sometime you want to test a new tool in the DevOps pipeline. And when this tool is actually tested, and that is part of your pipeline, if you want to switch to Terraform, to Pulumi, or any other tool, before moving this entire fleet change, you want to test some of the testing inside the pipeline. So are those capabilities can be doable? If not, if there are way we can actually use Octeto CLI to create some CI/CD pipeline, spin up some environment, test things up, tear it down, and then back to the normal.
Yep. So that is exactly what this is, right? Like, if you we also have like if you check out the product, we have like a GitHub action which is called preview environments, and what that does is when someone just makes a pull request, then that will deploy that pull request in an actual environment. So that gives you like the CI/CD part of like your normal CI/CD tests would run on that particular pull request. So that could be a way for you to try out tools like Pulumi or Terraform. Or the other way could be like, that's the thing with these environments, like the possibilities are endless. It's just like your brain's whatever you want to do, because now that you have this cluster, right, you have like Octeto CLI installed, you can install anything else. Like if you want to install a service mesh and see how that works with your application, you can do this on your development cluster. But to say that like the CLI supports that as a feature, I feel that's not correct, because it's not really a feature of the Octeto CLI itself, but the whole idea of moving development to Kubernetes just enables that for you. Because now, since you have that cluster and you have this file synchronization capability on that cluster, you can install whatever you want on the cluster, try out Terraform, try out service meshes. And not only that, but you can now see how your application behaves with that. And if you want to change something on that application, you can do that immediately instead of having to commit or rebuild the application images. So that's, I think, where the magic is.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's really the shine, as you mentioned, like absolutely. Because currently, what we actually the struggle is every time I want to do a change, I want to set a commit to the GitHub repository, and then the GitHub repository triggers some action using GitHub action, and then I want to see a change live in the how this feel like. This can be a good step, but it's a lot of pain every time. Even a small change you have to commit in a git repo, and sometimes if you go look at the GitHub risk history, you kind of confusing why I have
Yeah.
done these commits, and that's
Yeah.
quite confusing. And if somebody's actually watching your presentation and your demo, they're really kind of inspiring, because you changing locally and it's actually in the happening in the dev
Happen
container, and all
in
the
the
all
Kubernetes
happen.
cluster. And like we
Yes,
changed the title,
absolutely.
you can change, like you can work on any changes, hit save, and like none of, like you saw, in nowhere in the process did I run any git command or push it. Now I will actually push my code when I have made that bug fix or added that feature, because there is no need for me to bring CI into the picture, because I can already go and see if my application is working. And what's beautiful is that, like, you saw that now that the entire application is up, right? You as a developer can just run end-to-end tests on it, because this is the entire application which has been brought up. This is not just one service running locally. So it really shifts the entire like software delivery process towards left and gives control, back to developers, whereas earlier developers had to be reliant on DevOps people, or just manually have to deploy to staging environments and then send the URLs to testers and all of that. Now they can just do it on their own, or even pass that URL to someone on their team to run tests.
Yes, absolutely. And just a few last few questions, like in a setup, in a company setup, where we have thousands, even hundreds of developers working in a team. So how this like is there any approach that the entire organization can shift to the Octato based development environment? So can I use Octato as an organization fleet development environment? And then how the responsibilities goes, like what do developers do, or they're spending up Octato CLI all the time, or some automation in place, or some DevOps or the platform team can build some environment for them, and then they're basically using it.
That's very good question. And like, so we have a customers like Monday.com. I don't know if you've heard of them, but like they run like, I think they have like a large number of developers, 1,000 or something, running like a lot of their development workloads on Octato. And the way a typical workflow works is like you have a Kubernetes cluster, and like you install Octato on that cluster. We have a Helm chart, you install that, and then and this is something which the platform team does. And what then the platform team also does is that they create these, Octato YAML, that Octato manifest we saw, the build deploy dev sections. They create those for applications repositories, like all the applications in your, you know organizations repositories, and then you commit them and everything's in GitHub. Now once that is done by the platform team, the only thing developers have to do is just install Octato CLI. And I didn't show the UI, but I can do that if you want me to. But then just go to the UI of their Octato instance, and then from there they can click deploy, and they will see a list of all the GitHub repositories the organization has. Choose any one of them, and with this kind of like mimics the Octato deploy phase. Like they don't even have to run Octato deploy, they can do everything from the UI. And once the application is deployed, run Octato up and start developing. So the burden entirely goes away from developers from having to set up anything. The platform team basically just creates a Kubernetes cluster, installs Octato on that cluster, the Helm chart, and then basically just sets up the Octato manifest for all the applications their developers might be using. And as a developer, you only have to do one thing: install the CLI, run Octato up, and just get developing.
Yes, absolutely. I think if anybody is listening to this, this is quite interesting and quite innovative, because this is really a pain in the industry right now. Because in order to deploy your application, you need to spin up Kubernetes cluster. Somebody like it, some nerdy people really want to spin up cluster locally, but I don't want. My job is not to play with Kubernetes. My job is to actually work with the feature that the customers need, and I want them to give the features in the hand of the customers as soon as possible, so they don't left our company and the business not get lost. So that's a really shinier and neater approach to work with. Thank you very much, Arsh. But without you, I will leave you off. What is next coming? What is in the horizon? And what's new we can actually expect to see, and some new Civo Navigate stuff that Octato is actually sponsoring and going there. Can you share some events highlight plus some features highlight?
So we are actually working on pretty cool features right now, which I don't think I can tell you about. But if you go to our website and like subscribe to our newsletter, you will be in loop with what all we have been doing. But what I can talk you about is one of the features we shipped a couple of months ago, and it's really a game changer according to me in how development would work. Is that if you remember in this application, in the deploy section, we only ran like Helm commands, right? And that those Helm commands only create Kubernetes resources for you. But now if you see our full platform, then not only supports Kubernetes resources, but it also supports provisioning cloud resources. So like S3 buckets in AWS, like RDS databases in Google Cloud, whatever. And not just one cloud, you can provision resources in different clouds, and then those resources can be configured to work with the application. So we call this feature external resources. um, I can send you some blogs on this if you want to read more. But if you go to octato.com/blog, you'll see a lot of our content, which is not only teaching about Kubernetes, but about our latest features. So that's really a favorite feature because uh, now applications are evolving and a lot more, we are leveraging like S3 buckets and RDS database, and all these like cloud resources are becoming a part of their application. So with that, you need to, like doing them locally is just no longer possible, right? Because like how do you create a S3 bucket locally? Now there's local stack and all of that, but like the goal is that, whatever you need, whatever your application needs in production, you should be able to create that in development very easily. So that's a really cool feature. Um, Talking about, wait, I found the blog. I don't know if I can, I'd send the blog link in the studio chat if anyone wants to see. But talking about events, we were just like last month we were at Kubernetes Community Days Munich, which was like a very very well organized event. I really liked it. And like I also had a talk there with a friend from Commodore. They're also startup in the same space. We talked about backstage and development experience, same kind of topics. But that was a really nice event, and we had a booth there. And we are going to be next at Sivo Navigate. So if you're going to be attending, please come, make sure to say hi. Ramiro, who's one of the founders, and one of our solutions architect, David, are going to be there. I'm 50-50 if I'll be there, but if I am, please come say hi. Ramiro also has a talk at Sivo Navigate, so make sure you check that out. And we'll also have some swag giveaways. So if you're attending, just come say hi and sign up for cool things. Otherwise, obviously we'll be at KubeCon NA. So those of you who attend KubeCons, like that's
Yes,
another chance to meet
absolutely.
us.
Great, 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 and wonderful insight. So I think if you are in the Cebu Navigate, don't miss a chance to meet Octato team because they have solving some of the very, very interesting problems in the industry right now, and all of those are really fascinating because there's a movement around removing the cognitive load from the developers, and that's one of the way to remove the cognitive load from developers. So thank you very much, Arsh. Wonderful demos, wonderful preparation. Really like about it. I hope you can share some slide with me. I can share with the community as well after we disconnect from
Yeah.
here. So here are some things to follow up. First, follow Arsh if you want to learn more around Octato. Follow him first, and then go to the octato.com developer experience automation. But just have so much to unpack. We're just actually scratching the surface today. Here is the Twitter handle for all the talk around all the latest updates around Octato. GitHub, if you like it, and hopefully you like it, then do not forget to give it a star. And there are some blogs for your reference. Number one, go to this repository and try Octato in your own workstation and see how things work. And there are some blogs in the Octato website, and there are some wonderful customer list, wonderful enterprises who are using this awesome open source tool. So with that, thank you very much. I hope you liked the conversation. If you have any more question, ping us on the Twitter or in the CNCF Slack, any place to see us, ask question, and make us help more innovative solution for the community. With that, we will be meeting again next time with Savalcha's open source project of weeks from now. Till then, have a wonderful day. Stay safe, stay healthy. Bye bye,
Thank you for
everyone. Have a
having me.
wonderful day.
Have a great day. Bye.